going on stage 10 o'clock at night, in the alley by the back door of the Bravehearts bar. Like the previous time, Klein, in his black double-breasted frock coat and matching half-top hat, had merely circled the bar once before he walked to the nearest street as though he were on a stroll. Just as he walked out of the alley, a carriage stopped in front of him. Behind the glass window was Merrick's pair of brown eyes, which were still suppressing any signs of malicious intent. Klein pressed the top of his half-top hat and, holding the sturdy cane in his hand, calmly boarded the carriage as if he had hailed it himself. He sat down and straightened his bow tie like a gentleman attending a banquet. That outfit isn't suitable for battle. Merrick, who was wearing a white shirt, black vest, and tights, sized him up a few times and frowned. It was obvious that he still had some doubts regarding Klein's strength, but he had chosen to trust Sharon. Klein smiled casually and said, "My Beyonder powers are different from yours. Our fighting styles are different too. This type of clothing will not affect me negatively in any way. It even suits me very well. For example, it has a lot of pockets, and they can be used to store different items in different places, so as to avoid taking the wrong things when in a hurry and losing my life through such a laughable mistake." As he spoke, he took out the remaining 3 sedatives from a sewn concealed pocket. They were the special sedatives concocted by the apothecary. Just as he finished his sentence, a figure quickly outlined itself on a window of the carriage. A figure wearing a long black regal dress and a small soft hat. It was none other than the Sequence 5 Beyonder of the mutant pathway, Wraith Sharon. "You explain too much." Sharon looked at Klein and said in an ethereal tone, "Not natural enough." "I just wanted to get into the act," Klein laughed dryly and replied, "Probably it's because I'm a bit nervous." Without waiting for Sharon to speak again, he handed the 3 sedatives to Merrick. "Find a chance to drink it yourself. Team's sure that you're more experienced than I am. You won't drink it too early or too late, much less drink too little or too much." Merrick looked at the sealed and transparent glass test tube, gently shaking the liquid inside, and said, 2.5. Any more and I will really be sedated. I wouldn't do anything for a short period of time." "Very good," Klein praised and turned to look at Sharon. "Have you guys decided on the ambush spot?" Sharon nodded. "We are on the way there." She didn't directly reveal the intended location to Klein. "Very prudent, very careful," Klein thought for a moment before asking, "Will you be hurt by purification?" "As a zombie, yes. Same when I'm in my spirit state," Sharon explained succinctly. In other words, when a Sequence 5 Wraith is still in their physical state, the purification effects wouldn't be effective, Klein thoughtfully asked. "What about exorcism? What about demon hunting?" As they were dealing with a Beyonder of the same pathway, Sharon didn't hide anything from him. "Demon hunting will deal damage to our bodies. Likewise for exorcism, to both our bodies and spiritual bodies. But it wouldn't be fatal." Klein curled his lips into a smile and exhaled. "T understand." He pondered for a moment, and he asked again after some deliberation, "Do you feel the power of purification and exorcism now?" "No," Merrick replied hoarsely. "Very good. This spirituality cage, modified from a wall of spirituality, is indeed able to isolate the effects of the sun brooch. However, I'm so hot," Klein secretly sighed and confirmed. "Wraith Steve, Zombie Jason, and Werewolf Tyre, do they have any other mystical items or Beyonder weapons besides the Scarlet Lunar Corona?" "We don't know." Merrick pinched his glabella, looking a bit irritated. With the battle at hand, he couldn't help but be stirred by these emotions while suppressing his maliciousness and desire. Sharon listened silently and replied without any hints of discomposure. "When influenced by the Scarlet Lunar Corona, Jason and Tyre will be in a rather fervent state. Even if they have mystical items, they would lack the reason to use them. Unless it's something passive," added Merrick. "But to a werewolf, their claws are their Beyonder weapons. It's the same for me, Tyre, and Jason. It can tear through steel and comes with venom." Klein's eyes darted about as he nodded. "All right, I have no more questions." In the night with few pedestrians, the carriage sped across the streets, its wheels going over puddles of water from time to time, splattering fine dirt onto itself. After 10 minutes or so, Merrick had the zombie driver stop the carriage. Klein looked out through the glass window and saw a dark, dilapidated building. Not far away, the sound of running water could be heard. "This is the West Balham dock that has been abandoned for a year and is about to be rebuilt. Our planned ambush point will be around its warehouses," Merrick introduced. The abandoned West Balham dock. If an accident were to really happen, The Tussock River would be the best escape route. According to my previous survey, there is a lever cathedral about 2 kilometers northwest of here, one belonging to the Church of the God of Steam and Machinery. Klein quickly recalled his surroundings. He disembarked from the carriage, tidied up his clothes in a leisurely manner, and with his cane in hand, followed Sharon and Marek into the dock which awaited renovation. After walking for about 5 minutes, they came to an open space surrounded by several warehouses. The soil here was dark brown, with withered weeds lying everywhere. A wooden chest quietly sat in a dark corner. "Those are the explosives you asked for." Marek pointed. Klein immediately nodded and said, "Aren't you afraid that a tramp might steal them? My zombies are sleeping underground here. If anyone enters, they will scare that person away." Marek pointed to a few other spots. "Avoid them when you bury the explosives." "No problem." Klein smiled and nodded before asking, "Will my purification and exorcism effects hurt your guy?" "No, they are equivalent to corpses when in deep slumber, and there's also a thick layer of soil shielding them." Marek gave an affirmative answer. After looking around, Sharon became talkative for once. "Stay here and make your preparations. We'll go and lure the enemy over. TT won't take more than 30 minutes. Please make use of the time. After you finish your preparations, hide in a warehouse. Don't be in a hurry to make your move. Make sure to be patient. No matter how dangerous the situation is, treat it as normal. When I become weak and the scarlet lunar corona appears, you can use that eye to search for Steve and launch a sudden attack on it. I will also use my mystical item to complement you." Klein listened attentively, chuckled, and said, "A very simple plan." "The simpler the plan, the more effective it is," Sharon calmly responded. Marek pinched his forehead, shook his head, and said, "Steve isn't a fool. If any problem arises in a complicated plan, it will lead to a complete disaster." After they finished their exchange, Sharon vanished and Marek quickly departed from the dock. After watching them leave, Klein took out a small square metal box from his pocket. Its surface was covered in a thin film of spirituality. This was the spirituality cage that had been modified from a wall of spirituality. It could, to some extent, isolate the outside world from the effects of certain mystical items, but it couldn't abate the negative effects they had on the possessor. Of course, sealed artifacts which were too powerful or too strange were definitely not something that a spirituality cage could deal with. They required a special sealing environment that was specially designed for it. 4 warehouses overgrown with weeds. The ground is muddy from the rain earlier. Klein took out a piece of paper and shook it. Puh! The paper quickly became taut and as hard as an iron plate. Klein held the note and dug a shallow hole in the middle of the open ground. He buried the small square iron box in his hand. There was only a thin layer of soil between it and the outside world. Next, he took out the explosives from the wooden box and buried them in different corners and in different warehouses. He buried the remaining explosive sticks near the center. After finishing all of this, he took out his revolver and adjusted the ratio of the bullets again, 3 purifying bullets and 2 exorcism bullets. Putting away the revolver in his underarm holster, Klein tidied his clothes, walked to a gap between 2 warehouses, and threw a paper figurine there, right above some buried explosive. He examined his surroundings again, and then he took out another square metal box. He removed the spirituality cage on its surface and took out the dark golden sunbird-shaped brooch, solemnly wearing it on his left chest. Klein let out a breath, left the place, circled the exterior, threw out some inconspicuous items, and burned away the used piece of paper. When he returned, he climbed to the top of one of the warehouses and hid in the shadows. Reaching out his hand, he counted and confirmed the various charms, extract, and herbal powders. He touched the iron cigarette case and snapped his finger. The paper figurine he had left between the 2 warehouses stood up and transformed into a gentleman wearing a black double-breasted frock coat, a silk half-top hat, and was holding a hard cane. The gentleman's position was rather remote and hidden, making it difficult for anyone who came in from the outside to notice him. With his stand-in present, Klein's figure disappeared from where he stood. However, his vision wasn't affected in any way, and he could clearly see the road that led to the clearing. Even though he had made preparations and had experienced many battles, Klein was still a bit afraid and nervous at that very moment. No matter how good a performance was, it could still be seen through. Furthermore, the enemy was a Sequence 5 wielding a mystical item. There was also a Sequence 6 and Sequence 7. Is this the state every magician is in before he goes on stage? Klein took a silent breath, suppressing his emotions and the heat of his body. That night the crimson moon was constantly obscured by the clouds, and there was only a glimmer of light in the clearing. Before long, Klein saw 3 figures rapidly approaching. One in front, one in the middle, and one at the back. Werewolf running ahead of the group was Marek. His disheveled hair was completely blown back by the wind, and his expression was twisted and hideous. It was even faster than a steam locomotive at its peak speed. With a whoosh, he arrived at the entrance to the clearing. But even so, he was still unable to escape from his pursuer. The closest figure to him was a man who had the same pale complexion as himself, with indistinct, dark patches on his face, as if they were healing marks from rotting wounds. The malice in his eyes was completely undisguised and unrestrained. He looked more like a zombie who was craving fresh flesh rather than a human being, and Klein guessed that he was Jason, a Sequence 6. The distance between Jason and Marek remained within 7 or 8 meters, sometimes lengthening, sometimes shortening. This repeated again and again as they ventured back and forth. More than 10 meters behind them, a figure was left far behind. It was a thin but muscular man. His hair was shaved very short, and his hair stood erect like spikes. As he swung his arms, the tip of his palms flashed with a metallic light, reflecting the weak crimson moonlight. Those were black fingernails, which were as long as daggers. Werewolf Tyre, Klein chanted the person sequence and named silently. In his mind, the wall that was splashed with blood appeared in his mind. It was a scene with intestines and limbs splattered all over the ground. Taboo, taboo, taboo. Marek used all his strength as he ran, while Jason gritted his teeth and ran as fast as he could. At some point, the healed dark spots on his face began to swell, as if some sort of rotten liquid was about to ooze out. The two of them left the puddles of water and moist soil that were turning into white frost in their wake. The withered weeds were lifted up by the wind created by the two of them. As they slowly fell down, they began to rot and decay at a speed visible to the naked eye. Suddenly, a pale hand reached out of the frosted soil and accurately grabbed Jason's ankle. Puh! Jason twisted his body and forcefully kicked out, breaking the hand's wrist and sending it flying. The remaining stump's flesh and blood had long since rot, and white maggots struggled to squirm outward. Marek stopped, pinched his lips with his right hand, and let out a shrill whistle. Bang! 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 The soil in different parts of the clearing were lifted, and the expressionless corpses sat up. At the same time, a chilly wind suddenly swirled. Countless transparent shadows seemed to have caught the scent of a bloody feast, and none of them wanted to fall behind as they rushed towards Jason. Some pulled his arms, some pulled his calves, and some even hugged his head. Jason stopped and grunted. The shadows flew out, one after another. Some of them screamed miserably and disappeared, while others stayed in their original spots, lost. At almost the same time, Marek and Jason both raised their right hands, thumbs held up beside their forefingers, with their index fingers aiming at each other. Silently, the air between them exploded as black wisps of air billowed up. Marek took a step back, and a few strands of his disheveled hair withered in a blink of an eye and fluttered to the ground. Marek, you're still so weak. You still don't understand how to use the power of desire, Jason said with a low, hoarse laugh. At this moment, Werewolf Tyre had already arrived at his side. As for Steve, the Sequence 5 Beyonder in charge of the operation, was nowhere to be found. Don't be in such a hurry to finish off Marek. Wait for Sharon to come and save him. Lord Steve is about to arrive, Werewolf Tyre whispered to Jason. He then extended his bright red tongue and licked his lips. I wonder what Sharon will look like when she has her clothes off. Before he could finish his sentence, he suddenly saw Jason turn his head. His face was deathly pale, and there were 2 identical figures in his eye. Black regal dress, light blonde hair, exquisite face, and pale skin. Puh! He struck out with both palms and gripped Werewolf Tyre's neck. A creaking sound of bones giving way sounded out. Wraith Sharon had attacked. Tyre inhaled sharply, making his neck bulge like a water pipe. It grew strands of stiff black hair, and briefly resisted the force that would snap his windpipe and neck. His eyes gradually rolled backward, showing its whites as his red tongue hung out and sticky saliva drooled down his lips. However, his right hand had accurately reached into his pocket. He had cracked a preset spirituality seal. The empty clearing, together with the warehouses, suddenly lit up as crimson moonlight filled the entire area. Jason's grip on Werewolf Tyre's neck began to weaken, and a figure in a small, soft hat appeared behind him. Tyre's face broke into a smile that was both smug and cruel. His right hand took out a miniature full moon from his pocket, a crimson full moon. It was a dark red accessory that constantly emitted a serene luster. Shaped like a full moon, it had crimson rubies embedded along its circumference. In the middle was a symbol that symbolized the moon, as well as many other mysterious labels. Sharon narrowed her eyes instinctively and retreated 2 steps back. Her incorporeality slowly receded. Her legs no longer seemed capable of supporting her weight. She fell limply to the ground, her black and complicated regal dress stained with dust and mud. Werewolf Tyre raised the palm-sized round accessory high up into the air, laughing as he gasped for breath. Lord Steve was right. You would definitely attempt to counterattack. And Sharon, your target for possession would definitely be Jason, whose sequence is higher than mine. Therefore, the Scarlet Lunar Corona was given to me. Guess where is he now? This isn't as Sharon had expected. It seems like I can only choose the best opportunity to strike myself. Klein frowned as he heard this, and he forcefully suppressed the anxiety in his heart. At this point, Werewolf Tyre was in no hurry to attack. He knew that the longer the effects of the Scarlet Lunar Corona lasted, the weaker Sharon would become, and the more Marek would be in pain. In Jason's cold eyes, which usually had a hint of savagery and madness, there was no longer any rationality in them left. He was also affected by the Scarlet Lunar Corona, but he was used to indulging in his desires, so he didn't feel any pain. Instead, he felt a thirst for the fresh flesh before his eyes. Gasp! Jason let out a low, inhuman growl from his throat. His exposed skin and hair turned white. At that moment, Sharon raised her arms with difficulty and used her left hand to remove the black glove that she wore on her right palm. Jason happened to lunge at her, and a thin layer of ice covered the soil around her. Suddenly, endless rays of light burst forth from Sharon's palm. As they fed on Sharon's spirituality, they interweaved in front of the doll-like lady to form a bronze door, which was covered with mysterious patterns and filled with an indescribable smell. The door swung open with a creak, and a crack appeared. From the crack, pairs of pale or transparent hands or arms covered in teeth or bloody, skinless arms, stretched out, crossed the void and grabbed zombie Jason. Indescribable pairs of eyes were hidden in the darkness behind the door, quietly watching the prey in front of them. Before he could even react, Jason was grabbed by the arms, and he was entangled by smooth and incorporeal tentacles. These tentacles were dark green vines that had countless baby faces protruding out. These strange entities were crying and laughing as they tried to drag zombie Jason behind the door. Even though his thoughts were completely controlled by his bloodlust and the urge to kill, Jason instinctively felt afraid. Gasp! The sound from his throat suddenly intensified, and layers of frost immediately appeared on the worrisome-looking arm. The dark green vines that protruded from the baby's faces emitted painful groans as they continuously dripped with decayed, turbid yellow liquid. The pulling force abated, but it did not disappear. Jason kept directing ghosts to interfere, but it was like throwing a stone into the sea. Even when he tried to use spells from Death's domain, they failed to deliver any striking results. His body began moving uncontrollably towards the crack of the illusory, mysterious door. Occasionally, he would manage to struggle and retreat a little. As he had taken a sedative in advance, Marek was not completely taken down by the pain. Taking advantage of this, he took out the last 2 sedatives, broke the bottle with a snap, and drank 1.5 glasses in one go. The suppressed malice in his eyes weakened, and his twisted expression returned to normal. He swept his gaze at Werewolf Tyre. At the same time, with a swoosh, Tyre's thin but muscular body disappeared and reappeared more than 10 meters away. As his figure began outlining itself, an illusory image was left behind. A black aura that seemed to be alive rose up from the ground, pierced through the remnant images, and disappeared with a flicker. Tyre hadn't used Blink, as his sequence didn't have the corresponding Beyonder powers to do so. He had relied on the Scarlet Lunar Corona to push him to his maximum speed. The speed at which he moved produced afterimages. At that moment, Klein, who was hiding in the shadows at the top of the warehouse, also reached into his pocket with his left hand, touching the iron cigarette case. He removed its surface spirituality cage and gently opened the case. He was sure that Wraith Steve had already arrived at the scene. Otherwise, Jason definitely would have been dragged behind the terrible door if the deadlock continued. As for Wraithtyre, despite being augmented by the scarlet lunar corona, he was unable to instantly finish Marek off. When Sharon aimed the door of mysteries at the werewolf, the scarlet lunar corona would end up changing owner. As soon as Klein's fingers touched the all-black eye inside the metal cigarette case, his mind filled with crazy, foul, and terrifying raving. There were terrifying ravings that made his blood vessels bulge. He felt as though his eyes were cracking, and his head could explode at any moment. And in the midst of these ravings, Klein saw strange, mysterious, and illusory black threads. They were divided into groups, some of them extending to Sharon's body, some of them from Werewolf-Tyre. They intertwined with each other, without entangling themselves as they extended into the void. Among them, many of the black lines came from a spot not far away from Marek, and they didn't overlap. Wraith Steve. He wants to possess Marek. With a thought, Klein retracted his left hand. Instead of drawing his gun to shoot, he snapped his fingers without making much of a sound. Boom! An explosion suddenly occurred between the two warehouses. The raging flames and heat caused a figure wearing a black double-breasted frock coat to float out. After catching the attention of the others, Klein quickly drew his gun and pulled the trigger at the spot he remembered. At the same time, the dark golden sunbird brooch on his chest flashed with a ray of light. He added cleave of purification to the purifying bullet. Bang! The bullet shot out with a faint golden beam of light. A faint golden stream of light flashed past, hitting what seemed like an empty space. However, resplendent flames suddenly rose up from that spot, rapidly forming a silhouette who was wearing a black tuxedo and a dark red cloak. The figure's left arm was burning with holy and pure flames as it continuously emitted faint black and green smoke, illuminating his pale face in dark green glow. It was a man in his 40s with oily hair that was neatly combed with meticulous attention. His eyes were dark and green, and while possessing no emotion, there were no signs of pain. Wraith Steve. He turned his head and looked maliciously at Klein, who was at the top of the warehouse. Klein was startled as he felt his body suddenly turn cold. Even the heat brought by the sun brooch couldn't counteract. His body stiffened quickly, and his eyes glazed over. His pupils reflected the same two figures, a black tuxedo, a dark red cloak, a head of hair slathered with oil, a pair of dark green eyes, and the pale face of a man in his 40s. Almost in an instant, Klein was placed under Steve's control, his thoughts gradually numbing. This was the ability of a Sequence 5 ray. It was a strange and hardly defensible ability. Fortunately, he was adequately aware of everything beforehand and was already prepared for it. Moreover, the exorcism effect could effectively resist the possession of evil spiritual beings, so before his ability to think had completely disappeared, he stimulated the spirituality of his spirit body and injected it into the dark golden sunbird brooch. Just as he was about to raise his hand to grab hold of his neck, a warm and pure ray of light suddenly descended from the sky. It was like a pillar of light from the sun, bringing with it a feeling of brilliance and holy purification as it enveloped Klein within. It was a spell from the sun domain, holy light summoning. Amidst the holy light, the formless possession ability was weakened, and Klein's eyes suddenly regained their luster. In close succession, his body ignited, becoming brittle and charred, leaving behind a thin piece of paper. At the same time, between the gaps of the two warehouses, Klein, in his double-breasted frock coat and matching silk half-top hat, jumped out of the roaring flames from the previous explosion. His cane had been thrown away somewhere long ago, and the same figure floating above his head had also been successfully destroyed by the flame. It turned into pieces of ashes and scattered in every direction. Before Klein could confirm his situation, he felt an invisible grip on his ankle. There was a firm grip on his calves, arms, chest, and clothes. In his spirit vision, which had long been activated, Klein saw blurry, transparent figures. Some of them were incomplete, some were covered in blood, some of them had burnt black skin, and others were pale and cold. A cold wind of unknown origins blew at his neck, making his hair stand on end, and made his body tremble uncontrollably. The dark golden sunbird brooch in front of him suddenly flashed with a brilliant light, and golden illusory flames started flaring up around him one after another. These flames emitted the aura of the sun, and because they were so dense, they formed a sea. This was the fire of light from the sun domain. The ghastly ghosts around Klein shrieked silently and vanished, and the cold wind at the back of his head was replaced by the scorching heat of the sun broke. Klein, who was temporarily safe in this environment, couldn't help but sigh in fear. Even though he had prepared ahead of time and had obtained items to counter his opponent, a one-on-one battle with a Sequence 5 Wraith was still precarious. The performance had almost ended in failure from the very beginning. Not too far away from Marek, the dark red-cloaked Steve's figure turned slightly incorporeal. The bright flames on his left arm were quickly extinguished under the onslaught of the black aura. His eyes shone with dark green light, filled with malice and desire. He seemed to have lost his mind and ability to think. At this moment, with the shot's warning, Marek had distanced himself and directed the numb-faced zombies who had crawled out of the earth to surround Werewolf Tyre. He created slippery layers of ice and rotting sludge in an attempt to affect his enemy's movement. Werewolf Tyre held onto the tiny full moon that was emitting crimson light as he ran without stopping. When he was blocked by a zombie, he casually swiped down. Whoosh! The zombie was immediately split into 6 pieces. The long rotten flesh and wriggling maggots sprinkled all over the ground. Werewolf Tyre froze for a moment, looking at his claws in disbelief. Only then did he understand that the augmentation that the scarlet lunar corona brought him wasn't only restricted to speed. He felt that he had mastered some powerful and strange spell. Tyre stopped running and turned to face the pale Marek. At this moment, zombie Jason was drawing closer to the illusory but mysterious door. His body was covered with dark green vines that had protruded from the faces of the baby. He was being dragged by arms that were either full of teeth or were skinless. His eyes were almost touching the crack of the bronze door as he stared coldly at the indescribable eyes hidden in the darkness. It was as if that place was the final resting place for his heart. No! His body, which was controlled by bloodlust and the desire to kill, shouted out shrilly. Werewolf Tyre, who was about to counterattack, stopped instantaneously. Clenching his teeth, he threw the miniature version of the Crimson Full Moon at Steve. Only by allowing a Sequence 5 Beyonder to regain his strength would he be augmented, allowing the battle to come to a quick end. Only then would Jason have a chance of being rescued. Upon seeing this, Klein's eyes lit up, and he immediately snapped his fingers. Puh! Boom! In the scarlet lunar corona's trajectory, a pre-buried explosive threw up the soil, blew out a strong, impactful gust of wind, and set off a scarlet flame. Being struck by this, the scarlet lunar corona was redirected and landed in another direction. Boom! Another explosive blew up, inducing a fiery light to rise up. Klein leaped up and pounced at the scarlet lunar corona, which wasn't too far from him. Suddenly, a pale palm appeared right in front of the scarlet lunar corona's landing spot and grabbed it. It was none other than Steve, who had disappeared and then reappeared. His instincts made him chase after the full moon. Puh! With a soft sound, Steve grabbed the scarlet lunar corona. His dark green eyes, which were full of malice and desire, gained a trace of spiritual luster. This caused him to return from the form of a pure wraith to Sequence 5 powerhouse. He smirked at Klein. He wasn't in a hurry to deal with this weak opponent, so he let his figure disappear once more. Klein, who had already thrown himself out, rolled twice, reached into his pocket with his left hand, and once again gently flipped open the iron cigarette case. He touched Risego's all-black eye. Amidst the ravings that caused his tears and snot to constantly flow, Klein saw more strange black lines, and from their origin he caught a glimpse of the invisible Steve. He was closing in on Sharon, who was slumped to the ground weakly, at high speed. He wanted to control her, rescue Jason, and put an end to the battle. Sharon was their main target for this operation. Klein suddenly retracted his left hand, and with a thought, he once again injected his spirituality into the sun brooch. 2, 1. A holy beam of light descended from the sky, enveloping Sharon from behind. Steve, who was wearing a dark red cloak, suddenly appeared a few meters away, barely avoiding the holy light. With the augmentation of the scarlet lunar corona, his speed was already frightening to the point of him being capable of effectively dodging in an instant. But at the same time, the genuflecting Klein had raised his right hand and pulled the trigger of the revolver. His target was Jason. A resplendent bullet flew out, aimed directly at Jason's back, and was about to help him enter the bronze door of mystery. But at that moment, Steve disappeared and reappeared behind Jason, blocking the bullet with his open left palm. Sizzle! The sunlight from the explosion made him shake his arm in pain. He narrowed his eyes as his skin was constantly charring and peeling, but it quickly healed. Suddenly, he heard a crisp sound. Klein had snapped his fingers again. Boom! A nearby explosive exploded. The resulting shock wave and bullet-like stones shot out in all directions. A large number of them landed on Jason's and Steve's body. No! With a blood-curdling scream, the clothes on Jason's side tore apart, and the quickly darkening white spots on his skin appeared as if fresh blood was about to seep out. A zombie with a body as hard as steel, this wasn't an effective injury, but to a person like Jason who was struggling to hold on, it was equivalent to the beckoning of death. He could no longer hold on, as those terrifying arms quickly pulled him into the crack of the bronze door. No! Jason's scream resounded into the distance as the mysterious and illusory door closed with a clang, devouring the rest of his screams and isolating it from the world. The clearing in the middle of the warehouses turned completely silent. Jason had completely disappeared, as though he had never been born into this world. Steve's eyes widened and he opened his mouth, letting out an angry screech, "Damn it." Bam! As his voice resounded, Klein felt as if someone had heavily hammered him in the head. His vision turned blurry, and whatever he breathed in smelled of blood. His vision had become blood-red. For a short time, his ears were filled with buzzing sounds, and he couldn't hear anything else. After Tyre delivered the scarlet lunar corona, he had grown black fur and sharp fangs. He was no longer immune to its effects, and painfully covered his ear. Blood even flowed out from the corner of his eyes and mouth. Marek, who should have seized the opportunity to grab him, was in an even worse state. His desire and malice, which had been suppressed by the sedative, had reared their heads once more, causing him to almost lose control of his zombie. His expression was extremely twisted. Translator, Atlas Studios editor, Atlas Studios. Due to Wraith Steve's shriek, the weakened Miss Sharon also revealed a painful expression. However, she still managed to close her palm with much difficulty, causing the rays of light to be severed, which caused the illusory, mysterious bronze door to disappear. Klein knew that the situation was turning bad. Enduring his headache, he quickly took a step back and entered the fire. His figure quickly disappeared and reappeared in another explosion that happened in a different direction. He had just jumped out in an attempt to strike back when he saw Steve, the middle-aged man with the dark red cloak, stop in his tracks instead of chasing after him, as though he was waiting for something. Klein suddenly felt agitated. His head felt dizzy and his stomach spasmed. He quickly weakened, but he had no idea why. Marek, who had just recovered from the sharp shriek, also had an abnormal reaction. He constantly stretched out his hands to grab at himself, as if his body suffered an uncontrollable itch. He gasped for breath as he used his long, sharp nails to rip apart his clothes and left white streaks across his body. The more he scratched, the deeper it became, causing its redness to seep out. Sharon fell to the ground, but she couldn't stand again. Her blue eyes lost their focus, as though she couldn't see anything. "Poison," she whispered the word. Not far from her, Steve looked at her tightly clenched fist. He seemed rather fearful of the bronze door that was covered with mysterious patterns and an indescribable smell. He didn't dare to recklessly make a move. In his right hand, he held the scarlet lunar corona, the crimson full moon that was releasing a cold glow. Using his left hand, he took out a brown, translucent glass bottle from his pocket, and he snorted. Biological poison bottle can be used to randomly create different kinds of toxin. As long as you open it, the poisons will gradually spread to its surrounding. TT will be effective in less than a minute, and the symptoms will only become worse. In 4 minutes, if you don't leave the poison-filled environment, then the corresponding effects will be unpreventable, such as death. What a pity. I thought Jason would be able to hold on to this moment. Sharon, you wouldn't have been affected since a spirit body isn't afraid of poison, but unfortunately, there's the scarlet lunar corona here, which prevents you from switching states. Perhaps you can give up resisting and let me understand your hidden charm. He appeared to be leisurely introducing the abilities of the mystical item in his hand, as though he wanted to wait for Klein and company to completely lose their ability to resist before attacking. However, Tyre didn't understand his intention. Under the influence of the scarlet lunar corona, the irrational werewolf started his counterattack without hesitation. He threw himself forward, flailed his claws, and swiped across Marek's body, tearing it apart. Clang! 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 The sound of nails tearing through steel sounded in succession, and Marek's skin finally showed signs of bloody wound. Klein pinched his forehead. It felt like his forehead was starting to heat up, but the negative effects weren't as bad as what Steve mentioned. It seems like the poison has been weakened by the sun, Broach's constant purification and purging effect. Klein suddenly sneered. Are you planning on attacking us after we succumb to the poison? Why do you think I didn't use fireworks just now? Why do you think I relied on explosives? With so many explosions, I've definitely attracted the attention of others. The official Beyonders nearby are rushing here at this very moment. You don't have much time left. Steve turned his head to look at Klein, whose face couldn't be identified thanks to the paint that was smeared on it. He suddenly laughed and said, I forgot there's a bug that I can easily deal with. Don't worry, you'll definitely be dead before the people from the church arrive. Before he could finish his sentence, Klein suddenly raised the revolver in his right hand and shot out a purifying bullet. Steve moved his footsteps slightly, traversing several meters in turn. Along the way, he left afterimages behind. However, Klein's bullet didn't hit where he had aimed. Instead, it hit the middle of the clearing, piercing through the soil and creating a loud commotion. A breeze of spirituality blew past, and both Marek's zombie and Steve's shadows stopped moving at the same time. In a split second, they charged out rapidly, charging towards the center of the clearing like a pack of hungry dogs at mealtime. Steve, who was about to use arcane methods to control Klein and easily kill him, was stunned for a moment. Then he revealed a puzzled and surprised expression. For some baffling reason, he discovered that he couldn't command the undead he controlled. It was a first for him. At the same time, Klein snapped his fingers, detonating a few more bombs and setting off scarlet flames that soared into the air in different locations. His figure leaped from one bonfire to the other as he blinked towards the clearing's exterior. You want to run? Steve whispered. Just as he was about to turn incorporeal to chase after his target, he found that the zombies and shadows had dug out a square metal box and were fighting for the item inside. Soon one of Shadow succeeded. Its body swelled, and seemingly gaining intelligence, it flew in another direction. So that item is used to delay my actions and allow him to successfully escape. Humph, he still doesn't understand what a wraith and the scarlet lunar corona is capable of. Steve temporarily gave up on chasing Klein. Putting away the biological poison bottle, his body suddenly disappeared and appeared on a thin layer of ice that formed in a puddle of water. He relied on his terrifying speed to drag out an afterimage and arrived behind that giant shadow. Steve's eyes flashed with a dark green light. The shadow instantly dispersed without a sound, and the item in its hand dropped. The other zombies and shadows, completely disregarding the oppressive aura of the mighty existence as they rushed over to grab it. Steve was more and more alarmed and curious. He discovered that his spiritual intuition couldn't draw any revelations from the object that had caused the rioting of the zombies and shadows. He stepped forward and grabbed the object with his left hand. It was a dark gold keyring. Hanging from it was an ancient and exquisite copper whistle. Beside the copper whistle hung a simple bronze key. They clung closely together as they remained in Steve's pale palm. At the same time, Steve's scarlet lunar corona in his right hand was quietly emanating a crimson glow, like a miniature full moon. Before thoughts even surfaced in Steve's mind, a faint but very strange sound entered his mind, ripping at his nerves and scraping his scalp. Steve let out a miserable scream and fell from midair to the ground. The scarlet lunar corona, which he held in his hand, and the key ring with the copper whistle and key were sent flying at the same time. He struggled and twisted on the spot, his body bulging and protruding. There were arms that were as small as babies which grew out of his body, or a foul, light yellow liquid that sloshed inside his body. At this moment, a flame ignited again. Klein, who had escaped, leaped out and appeared in the path of the scarlet lunar corona. He didn't attempt to catch the mystical item. Instead, with a gentle flick, he diverted its trajectory, sending it flying toward the weakened Miss Sharon. Steve's cries of pain gradually died down, and the scarlet lunar corona accurately landed on Sharon. Sharon's figure instantly turned incorporeal, and the blue eyes that had lost their focus regained their luster. Clenching her right hand tightly, her left hand held the palm-sized accessory inlaid with a ring of dark rubies. Her body began to float. The scarlet lunar corona allowed its wielder to be immune to the influence of the full moon. Sharon was no longer weak, and in her spirit-body state, she wasn't afraid of the biological poison. At this moment, The zombies and shadows gathered together once again, fighting over the chain master key and Azek's copper whistle. Klein didn't care. He raised his left arm and pointed. The sun brooch on his chest flashed a dark golden glow and disappeared. An intense, bright, and holy light fell from the sky, shrouding the group of zombies and shadows that were fighting over it. In what seemed like daylight, the transparent and bizarre shadows quickly melted and disappeared. The pale and stinking corpses emitted black smoke first before they ignited and burned like candles. By the time the light disappeared, there was almost nothing left except for Azek's ancient and intricate copper whistle and the master key, which were both strung on an already blackened key ring. They lay there silently. Meanwhile, Sharon didn't care about Marek, whose injuries were turning graver thanks to Tyre's attacks. Instead, she relied on her own ability to phase into mirror-like items to reach the thin piece of ice that Steve had previously used and stepped out. She stretched out her right hand towards Steve, who was transforming into a monster, and opened it wide, aiming the palm of her hand at the enemy. Endless rays of light burst out and quickly intertwined to form the mysterious patterned bronze door. Krieg. With a jarring noise, the small black hat on Sharon's head was blown away by a sudden gust of wind, and her carefully combed blonde hair cascaded down in a disheveled state. It was obvious that using the mystical item again was rather taxing on her. Krieg. The mysterious bronze door produced a crack, and a series of shrill laughter, sobbing and shouting echoed in the air. Arms either filled with teeth or completely without skin reached out wildly and grabbed at Steve, whose pustules were bursting one by one. The strange dark green vines that accentuated an infant's face, and the slippery, illusory tentacles also bound the Sequence 5 powerhouse. Steve cried out again. The pale yellow pus which flowed out covered his entire body, allowing him to barely resist the pull. A bright red crack appeared on his face, and in it was a hole leading to a dark tunnel. At that moment, Klein raised his revolver and aimed it at him. Without any delay or hesitation, with his face disguised, Klein calmly pulled the trigger while wearing his half-top hat. Bang! Bang! With a flash of the sun brooch, 2 bullets filled with holiness accurately hit Steve in the head. Although they didn't pierce his skin or bones, they ignited resplendent flames, turning Steve into a bright torch. With another scream, Steve was pulled closer to the illusory bronze door. As Klein released the revolver's cylinder, the shells fell to the ground, and he took out the metal box containing the Bayonder bullets. At the same time, he once again injected his spirituality into the sun brooch. 2, 1. A pure and flawless pillar of light fell from the sky and instantly hit Steve's body. Taking this breather, Klein inserted 3 purifying bullets and 3 exorcism bullets into the cylinder and snapped it shut. He aimed at Steve's head again, and with the flash of the dark golden brooch, he pulled the trigger hard 6 times in a row. Bang! 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 Fireworks one by one, the bullets sliced through the air, either swirling with a golden luster or emitting resplendent beams as they hit Steve's head. Thanks to Klein's control over his body and his persistence in practicing his marksmanship, Klein's 6 bullets, which were augmented with cleave of purification, accurately hit the same spot as the first 2 bullets. They were like fists from a giant of light, repeatedly pounding at the left of Steve's face. With a series of bangs, Steve, who had been entangled by the strange arms and the dark green vines, failed to phase away to avoid the attack. His head was whipped to the side repeatedly as his body trembled. His cheekbones quickly caved in, breaking out into sharp white bones. Bang! The last bullet completely tore through, splashing the Sequence 5 powerhouse's dark red blood. This opening allowed the resplendent and golden flames to continuously drill in, burning into bursts of dark green mist. In the holy light, Steve's clothes were ignited. His body was quickly charred as he dripped with grease. However, he was still alive. Compared to Nimblewright Master Rasago, the survivability of a Sequence 5 from the mutant pathway was clearly much better. However, the heavily injured Steve could no longer resist the strange tugging arm. His legs moved forward uncontrollably, almost flying towards that bronze door and into the deep crack that had opened. He was thrown into the darkness where pairs of eyes lurked. At this moment, Sharon suddenly clenched her right hand, her forehead covered in sweat. The illusory and subtle rays of light were abruptly severed, and the indescribably mysterious bronze door lost the source of its existence. It swayed, and before Steve entered, It reluctantly pulled back its long arms, which were either filled with teeth or blood, and sealed the crack. Creak. The door closed, quickly becoming transparent before it disappeared. Steve's leaning body was rigid in place, blackened and shriveled, like a mummified corpse that had been burned for a long time. With her right fist tightly clenched and the scarlet lunar corona on her, Sharon's figure rapidly turned incorporeal. She took a step forward and overlapped with Steve. Klein's spirit vision instantly lost sight of her. However, the charred Steve raised his fists and abruptly smashed them against his already severely injured head. Bam! His head turned into a pulp like that of a rotten tomato, and milky white spots sprayed out before splattering to the ground. A translucent figure was also expelled. It rapidly spread out, turning into something that looked like a giant jellyfish. Within it was a dreamlike liquid that was swishing, and a pair of deathly pale eyes that were condensing. Sharon was forced out by this strange object, and she reappeared beside it. She suddenly stretched out her left hand, letting out a silent shriek. The ground suddenly turned black, as if it had turned into a muddy deep sea. Twisted bloody vines grew out from it, splitting into many sections, with each section having 4 sharp teeth and an eye. The blood-red vine wildly grew upwards, immediately locking onto the jellyfish-like phantom as it greedily sucked the dreamlike liquid within. The phantom quickly collapsed, and the blood-red vine once again retreated back into the muddy deep sea. But with this delay, the headless, charred Steve began running. He tore across the clearing and headed for the way out. He still wasn't dead despite already losing his head. Steve had only run a few steps when a sudden crisp sound cracked in the silence. Puh! Klein, in a black double-breasted frock coat with a matching half-top hat, turned to him and snapped his fingers. Boom! The dirt beneath Steve's feet was violently lifted, and scarlet flames soared. It spread upward, and when it reached its highest point, it spilled down like beautiful fireworks. Steve's body was torn to pieces from such fireworks. His charred hands, feet, guts, and blood splattered everywhere. One of his fingers rolled to Klein's feet, and the brown, translucent biological poison bottle fell in another direction. The mutilated body, which was the last traces of Steve's existence, squirmed a few times before finally becoming still. In the scene with the blooming fireworks, Klein felt his spirituality become more active, and the powers that still wasn't completely his had become more attuned to him. In response to this sensation, he passed the revolver to his left hand. He took off the silk half-top hat from his head with his black-gloved right hand, and he pressed it to his chest and bowed slightly at Sharon. Sharon's blue eyes looked over. She looked past Klein to the carnage of werewolf Tyre and Merritt. Sharon's figure disappeared, and Tyre's eyes reflected her image. Tyre stood there stiffly, his black hair standing on end. He raised his arms with great difficulty and pressed them against his head. Catcha! He twisted hard, and his eyes soon saw his spine, which were underneath the cover of his torn clothes. Puh! Tyre twisted and pulled again, pulling his head out of his torso. Throughout the entire process, he didn't let out a single scream or a single word. He held his head, letting the blood constantly drip down. The corpse which had lost its head was still standing straight, without toppling. Sharon didn't immediately leave Tyre's body. She appeared to be attempting something. Very soon, bits of dark green light emerged from Tyre's head and body, quickly condensing onto one of his fangs as its core. It seems like Miss Sharon has a way of accelerating the separation of a Beyonder characteristic. The prerequisite to doing so requires her to possess the target, kill the person, and have complete control of the body. Enlightened, Klein bent down and picked up the shells that had fallen to the ground, stuffing them into the metal square box, one by one. He was afraid that the investigators, which would subsequently arrive, would find the artisan through the uniqueness of the shells, and hence find the woman who had purchased the Briber and Barbarian formulas from him. Then they would lock onto Eye of Wisdom's gathering, causing his safety to be threatened. As for the bullets, they had long been sacrificed to the corresponding deities in the holy light and flames, just like the materials in charm. Putting the revolver away, Klein was about to take a step forward when Sharon appeared beside the biological poison bottle with an exaggerated speed. She made it float up and land on her palm. Before Klein could think of anything else, the pale woman flicked her wrist and threw him a translucent brown bottle and a dark green fang. To save time, she's helping me pick up my spoil. Klein was startled. He instinctively pulled out a piece of paper and covered the two items. He didn't come into direct contact with them. At this moment, He could see that Sharon's complicated black regal dress had lost its usual tidiness and cleanliness. It fluttered gently in the wind, and a few strands of her light blonde hair were stuck to the side of her face, making her feel more like a person. This biological poison bottle comes with its own lid. I just wonder what negative side effects it has. Klein lowered his head and examined his spoils of war. He used the black cap hanging on the side to reseal the biological poison bottle so that it wouldn't continue to do him harm. As for the dark green fang, it was the Beyonder characteristic left behind by werewolf type. As Klein placed the two items into a small metal box he prepared, and he used holy night powder to create a wall of spirituality, blocking off the influence they had on their surroundings. He watched Sharon's figure disappear from the corner of his eye. Steve's remnant flesh squirmed and produced a nearly translucent point of light. Similarly, he was still on guard against Marek, lest he suddenly went crazy. Amidst this vigilance, he discovered that the healing powers of a zombie was truly astonishing. The bone-deep wounds from a moment ago had now basically closed. Marek also gave him a profound look. It was as though he had remembered something and understood something. When he was done, Klein walked a dozen steps away, picking up the square metal box that had been dug up by the zombies in shadow. Then he found Isaac's copper whistle and the master key, which were surrounded by human-shaped candles. He glanced at it and awkwardly realized that he didn't dare to pick them up. The effects of the scarlet lunar corona were still radiating through the clearing. This was the last trap he had set up, one that would never be used unless all other means were exhausted. For this, he had taken the time to visit a hospital's morgue and test out what the corpses would do after they had gotten their hands on Isaac's copper whistle. It allowed him to design a corresponding plan. And you stopped the influence of the scarlet lunar corona. Klein turned to look at Sharon, who had materialized again. She already had an additional translucent doll in her hand. Without saying a word, Sharon placed the scarlet lunar corona to her chest with her other hand. The circle of rubies quickly dimmed, and the light from the full moon disappeared from the abandoned lamp. Only then did Klein lean over and grab the keyring with his fingertip, raising up Isaac's copper whistle and the master key. Then he stored them in the square iron box with concave bullet marks and quickly created a seal. Meanwhile, Marek circled around and dealt with the scene. Sharon pulled up her small black bonnet, and her figure disappeared before reappearing in front of Klein. "The Book of Secrets is in your room," Sharon said calmly. "That is to say, no matter what the end result is, as long as I can make it back alive, I will be able to get a portion of the reward." "I wouldn't have gone through all this trouble for nothing," Klein smiled and bowed. "Thank you for your generosity. The official Beyonders will arrive any time soon. We have to leave." Sharon nodded and asked, "Do you need any help?" "There's no need." Klein chuckled. "I still have lots of fireworks which I haven't released." As soon as he finished his sentence, he raised his hand and snapped his finger. Boom, boom, boom. The remaining explosives exploded, one by one, sending flames up into the sky. They clustered around the largest and most eye-catching one in the center, producing a dreamy and beautiful scene. Sharon's gaze was instinctively attracted to it for a second, and when she looked back, Klein was no longer there. There was only a spark that gradually dissipated. Away from the clearing, he took a small detour northwest, preventing him from running into any official Beyonders on the way. One match after another was lit on the road, and the flames quickly soared up and then quickly disappeared. Klein's figure constantly emerged from within them as he leaped across the flames and departed the West Balham dock. Immediately following that, he took out a special bottle of extract and wiped it over his face. With a gentle wipe using a piece of paper, he removed all the paint. Puh! Klein shook his wrist and burned the paper to ashes. Then he picked up the cane he had hidden nearby, straightened his clothes, and walked out into the street like an ordinary person. Not long after, Klein arrived at a cathedral. Its name was Lever Cathedral. As many devotees weren't rich, they might not be able to rest on Sundays and were usually busy during the day. Thus, the cathedrals of the various churches typically opened until the early hours of the morning, giving most believers the opportunity to pray and repent. Klein looked up, tapped the steps with the black cane in his hand, and stepped inside. He intended to avoid the subsequent round of inspection of the surroundings people. A few minutes later, a machinery hiveman team appeared at the clearing surrounded by abandoned warehouses. There were a total of 5 of them, each armed with different kinds of Bayonder weapons. However, all of them frowned when they saw the cleaned-up scene. After looking for a moment, they began putting in effort to gather clues. Lever Cathedral. Since it wasn't even 11 yet, there were quite a few people here. However, not a single person spoke. The entire prayer hall was so peaceful and holy that no one wanted to break the silence. Klein sat in the third pew along the aisle. He leaned his black cane forward and took off his silk half-top hat. Wearing a black double-breasted frock coat, he clasped his hands against his lower jaw and closed his eyes. His expression was abnormally calm as he faced the triangle-shaped sacred emblem in front of him. Question and answer. After a full half-hour of uninterrupted silence, Klein opened his eyes and slowly rose to his feet. He took his cane, put on his hat, and left the cathedral, taking a rental carriage back to Mince Street in the dark. At this moment, the vigilance and surveillance of the surrounding area had inevitably relaxed, turning into the shadows under the light of the gas lamps. Shortly after midnight, Klein took out his key, opened the door to his house, and entered the empty guest rooms to search for the Book of Secrets. It didn't take him much effort to find the old book, bound in thick goatskin, in the wardrobe in a room on the first floor. The hardcover of the book was dark black, with 2 lines of Hermes written in crimson, Book of Secrets. Klarman. Klein exhaled, but was in no rush to read the book. Instead, he quickly constructed a wall of spirituality in the room, summoning and responding to himself via a ritual, and then he threw Azek's copper whistle, the master key, the all-black eye, the Bayonder bullets, the bottle of biological poison, the werewolf Bayonder characteristic, the Book of Secrets, and even all the vessels above the gray fog. He planned on waiting for the commotion to subside before deciding on which to take out and which to carry. After doing all this, he didn't even bother to study the werewolf Bayonder characteristic or the bottle of biological poison. He simply washed up and laid in bed. There were 2 reasons for doing so. Firstly, reading the book was too time-consuming. It was very easy to bring trouble to his body in the real world on this rather uncalm night. Secondly, Klein was aware of his current weakness, which was that the speed at which his spirituality was growing wasn't enough to satisfy his ever-increasing Bayonder powers and mystical items. After such an intense battle, his spirituality was already drained. His head was aching, and he was drowsy. Yes, the one thing that places the greatest burden on my spirituality are the paper figurine substitutes, followed by the creation of Sun Holy Water with the sun brooch, but it wasn't used tonight. Next in the list is Holy Water Creation and Flaming Jump. Klein yawned and used cogitation to get rid of the state of extreme tiredness and tenseness that prevented him from falling asleep. In less than 10 seconds, he entered the land of dreams as various fragmented scenes appeared alternately before him. In the clearing surrounded by the abandoned warehouses, the machinery hive mind came and went before coming again. The person in charge of investigating this incident went from being a team captain to an expert at the rank of deacon. Sir Bernard's brown hair remained unkempt and stuck out stubbornly, making it impossible to hide them even with a hat on. This led to many members of the machinery hive mind to secretly joke that the deacon probably used a bomb to style his hair. At this moment, Sir, with his cut jaw and facial features, was holding a silver mirror with ancient patterns on it. On each side of the mirror was an eye-like ornament. They were built on the foundation of a black gem, which looked serene and charming. Sir surveyed the area and said, although the rats in the sewers are experts at interfering with divination and mediumship, and had already dealt with the scene effectively, this is a mysterious Bayonder world, and there is no way to guarantee a 100% success. As he spoke, he looked at the silver mirror in his hand as he used his right hand to touch its surface thrice. After pausing for 2 seconds, Sir took a deep breath and said in a deep voice, "Respected Arrows, my question is, who were the participants in the incident that just happened here?" The surrounding darkness suddenly thickened, and the surface of the silver mirror began to ripple with aqueous light. Soon a scene appeared in the silver mirror. Amidst the rising flames, there was a figure floating in the air. He was wearing a black double-breasted frock coat and a half-top hat. His body was distorted, and his face was indistinct. Furthermore, his face was smeared with paint. Beneath his feet, flames rose up and engulfed him. As the aqueous light flashed, the scene changed. A middle-aged man in a dark red cloak appeared. His arm was burning with resplendent flames, but his head was hidden in the darkness. Scene after scene was played out in front of their eyes. They saw a woman with a complicated black regal dress and messy blonde hair. However, her face was completely transparent, as if she didn't exist. Beside this lady were two men with black fur all over their body. Only their backs could be seen, as they were being pulled by strange arms. Finally, the changes came to an end, as it fixed onto the blazing flames that soared into the sky. Fireworks bloomed in a splendid and resplendent fashion as they lit up the entire scene. In this dreamlike scene, the man in the black double-breasted frock coat appeared once again. Twisting and retracting, he faced forward, pressed his hat to his chest, and bowed slightly. Not only was his face extremely blurry after being interfered with, but it also presented a glisten of oil. Just as Ikanser was about to ask his teammates for their opinions, several lines of text in ancient Fasak appeared on the surface of the mirror. Based on the principle of reciprocity, it's my turn to ask the question. If you answer wrong or lie, you will be punished. The word punishment was blood red, as if it were dripping with liquid. The expression on Ikanser's face was twisted at first before it turned abnormally serious. Soon after, the mirror's aqueous light flashed, and a new line of text appeared. What's your sexual orientation? Ikanser was stunned, as he felt the gazes of his surrounding team members all land on him. 6 in the morning. The sky was just beginning to brighten. The sleeping Klein awoke to the punctual church bell. According to his usual habits, he would just turn around and continue sleeping until it was almost 8 o'clock. But this time, he immediately sat up and looked around. Yeah, I didn't get raided on the pretext of checking my gas meter. He let out a sigh of relief, and without even bothering to clean himself, he got off the bed and took 4 steps counterclockwise to go above the gray fog. He wanted to study his spoils from last night. Sitting in the fool's seat, Klein started from the simplest. He picked up the dark green fang and observed it for a few seconds. Then he conjured a pen and paper and wrote the divination sentence, its effects. This didn't mean that divination could be used as a substitute for experimentation. With the fact that he held the item in his possession, and how he knew a lot about prisoner, lunatic, and werewolf from Sharon and Marek, he believed that it was enough for him to attempt to gain some revelations from it. After reciting the statement, he quickly entered the dreamland and witnessed one scene after another. A vicious wound appeared on Werewolf Tyre's stomach, and his intestines flowed out as they were dragged across the ground. However, he only washed it with water and stuffed the intestines back into his stomach. He pinched both sides of the wound, and in the end the wound actually healed. Under the perfect red moon, he faced the sky and let out a long howl. Black fur grew out of his body inch by inch, and the fangs in his mouth were distinct. He waved his claws and cracked the steel plate that wasn't considered thin. He ran wildly through the wilderness, increasing the gap between him and the group of pursuing gray wolves as he ran further and further away. He made the attendants, whose eyes were glazed but cold, charge at their enemies without fear of death. He also used a variety of weapons to kill people, including bombs. And he became stronger as he lost his reasoning while in his enraged state. Opening his eyes, Klein roughly understood the characteristics of a werewolf and grasped the hidden dangers of this Beyonder characteristic. Werewolf Tyre had been under the full moon's illumination, allowing him to be unrestrained towards his desire. After his death, he left a relatively strong spiritual mark, so those Beyonders, who would use this Beyonder characteristic to concoct a potion to advance themselves to the next sequence, had to resist this kind of effect at an early stage. Otherwise, they would show signs of losing control. However, the negative effects had yet to reach the level of a sealed artifact, and the Beyonder characteristic left behind by the werewolf could still be used as the main ingredient for a potion. That's good, unfortunately. Zombie Jack's Beyonder characteristic has been swallowed by that strange door. I wonder where it leads to and if there's a way to get it back. Klein put down the dark green fang, feeling both regret and sadness for his loss, before picking up the bottom of brown translucent biological poison. He repeated the same procedure and performed a dream divination, but this time he didn't have the confidence to gain a detailed revelation. Therefore, he changed the divination statement to its positive and negative effects. In the gray gloom of the dream world, Klein once again saw tragic scenes. Someone fell to the ground, scratching himself and ripping off his skin, flesh, and even bones. Another person held his head, his eyes losing focus while his auras weakened. One kept vomiting. Towards the end, the person who died was convulsing. Someone burst out laughing, laughing so hard that he couldn't even breathe. Some people stopped fighting and looked at each other. Then they hugged and kissed each other. When the scene reached the end, The translucent brown bottle was placed into a cup with water. The transparent liquid inside gradually turned amber in color and was drunk. The person holding onto the bottle of biological poison was weakened at first before coughing. Then he touched his forehead. He found himself scalding as his condition turned for the worse. The dream quickly ended. Klein tapped his finger on the edge of the long table as he attempted to interpret the revelation with great difficulty. According to Steve, the earlier revelations mean that after the biological poison's bottle lid is removed, it would keep emanating its poison. As for which poison the opponent gets inflicted by, it's completely random, and even the wielder is unable to control it. The poison inside is really quite abominable. The effective range of the poison cannot be deciphered via revelation. Soaking it in water and drinking the amber liquid in advance would prevent one from getting poisoned. But how many minutes should the soaking take? Even if the person holding the biological poison bottle doesn't open the lid, their bodies would get worse as they slowly get infected, and the ailments become serious. What's the exact cutoff time? Klein rubbed his forehead, intending to do some experiments above the gray fog when he was free, but he didn't know if the biological poison bottle was effective in there. For example, in his current spirit-body state, he wasn't afraid of being poisoned at all. I'll leave it at this. I'll study it in detail in the future. Klein turned his attention to the Book of Secrets, which was bound in goatskin. He then casually flipped to the first page. It was a title page with simple patterns on it but with nothing written on it. Flipping another page, Klein finally saw the opening line of the Book of Secrets. We worship the moon, not the Evernight goddess. Another statement about only worshiping the moon and not the goddess. Klein couldn't help but have a look of contemplation. The last time he heard about such matters was when he was learning about the life school of thought. He never expected that the Shaman King, who had lived his entire life in the southern continent, would also have a similar point of view. In the Pale Era, at the end of the Fourth Epoch, the Berserk Sea became a veritable reality. Thus, the northern and southern continent were cut off from each other, and the life school of thought was formed in the early Fifth Epoch. Obviously, it was impossible for the life school of thought to extend itself to the southern continent before Roselle sent his men to find a safe sea route. Shaman King Klarman was a historical figure who was active in an era more than 1,000 years before the northern continent's invasion. In other words, the two Beyonder factions, which were in different continents, had no way of communicating with each other and had chosen to worship the moon itself and ignore the Evernight goddess at almost the same period of time. Such a coincidence inadvertently made one consider why. Could it be that the birth of a new god had taken away a portion of the authority related to the moon? But as a deity, he shouldn't be so obscure and unknown. In other words, although the goddess had snatched the authority of the moon, the followers of the primordial moon god had survived. They had been passed down from the Fourth Epoch or even the Third Epoch. Even after the separation of the northern continent and southern continent, they blossomed into two groups, one helmed by the Shaman King, the other by the life school of thought. Klein made a rough guess, but he was troubled by the lack of clues to narrow the scope. He gave up thinking about it for the time being, and quickly skimmed through the rest of the contents of the Book of Secrets. In the preamble, Shaman King Klarman said very directly that many of the rituals, deeds, astromancy, and summoning techniques in the book had originated from a primitive worship of the moon, and described the corresponding honorific names in detail. The one and only red moon, the symbol of life and beauty, the mother of all spiritual forces. There's actually an honorable name. However, it lacks the more popular descriptions like those of the Evernight goddess or Mother Earth. If there really is such a hidden god, his followers would inevitably develop a simpler title to address him. That's more suitable for praise than the worship of the primitive moon. Klein sensed something amiss as he began to analyze it with his own knowledge on mysticism. Besides, using the Lady of Crimson to hold a ritual would very obviously direct it at the goddess. But using an honorable name which is very similar but more detailed would circumvent the goddess, pointing it to the source of their power, the primitive moon. I wonder what arcane existence it is, Klein thought with wonder and alarm. Due to his lack of time, he skimmed through the details and found that, as Shaman King Klarman had said so himself, many of the deeds and rituals were directed at the moon. For Klein, it wasn't a cause for concern. He didn't plan on copying them wholesale and end up provoking the primitive moon, which he had no idea about. What he wanted to learn was the overall structure, design, and details of the deeds and rituals. Only by mastering the underlying rules could he come up with his own secret deeds, rituals, astromancy, and summoning techniques that pointed to the king of yellow and black. Perhaps in the far future, I'll have my own mysticism system. Klein removed the spirit pendulum from his wrist and finally confirmed the authenticity of the Book of Secrets. After receiving a clear answer, he was in no hurry to use the werewolf's Beyonder characteristic to divine a formula. After all, he wasn't able to sell it, and for the same reason, he decided to delay the research of the biological poison bottle for a while. He quickly returned to the real world and drew the curtains. He saw the sun, which wasn't capable of illuminating the land. It was hidden behind the clouds and fog, looking somewhat pale. Achoo! Suddenly, Klein covered his nose and mouth, and he sneezed. Only then did he realize that his head was aching and burning. He felt lightheaded and had seemingly caught a cold. I actually fell ill as a sequence 7 Beyonder. Klein pulled out a piece of paper and sniffed. He carefully thought back for a moment and quickly understood the reason. The negative effects of the biological poison bottle would gradually weaken the possessor and result in an illness. If it was carried around even longer, then it might even lead to death. And this effect couldn't be eliminated with the use of spirituality seal. Last night, Klein's spirituality was almost nearly emptied after the battle. While his body was still weak from the poison, he still carried the biological poison bottle with him and hid in Lever Cathedral for half an hour, adding the time spent on his return to Minsk Street, and he had embarrassingly fallen ill. Thankfully, it's not serious, it doesn't affect anything. Klein sneezed again as he prepared to soak himself in a hot bath. After washing his face and rinsing his mouth, he specially fried an egg to reward himself. The fragrance was truly tantalizing. A Shaman King's Book of Secrets and the biological poison bottle, a mystical item that's not worse than the sun brooch, as well as a sequence 7 werewolf's Beyonder characteristic. I made quite a killing this time. It's just a pity that I didn't manage to obtain the zombie Beyonder characteristic. Klein sat by the side of the dining table. As he ate, he did a tally of his spoil. What made his heart ache was the fact that he had used a total of 11 Beyonder bullets, each worth nearly 10 pounds. That is to say, I burned 100 pounds. It's really like throwing money to deal damage. It's no wonder most low and mid-sequence Beyonders are so desperate for money. Klein glanced down at his breakfast. They added up to only a few pence. After breakfast, Klein idly read the newspapers, sneezing from time to time as he wiped his nose and mouth with a piece of tissue paper. As soon as the church bell stopped chiming at 8 o'clock, his doorbell rang. Klein wasn't surprised to see the reporter for the Daily Observer, Mike Joseph. The reporter, with beautiful blue eyes and a thin mustache, but with rather rough skin, took off his hat and greeted him. Then he went straight to the point. "Detective Moriarty, do you have time to take the job?" Although he had a cold, he still needed to take on jobs like usual to avoid suspicion from anyone during this period of time. Klein, who had just finished a job, smiled and said, "I'm slightly ill, but that doesn't affect my fighting or shooting skill." Mike suddenly smiled and said, "Thank you for your help. Let's set off now. Detective Moriarty, have you had breakfast? I'll treat you. As your employer, I should be in charge of providing you your meals today." Inviting me to breakfast. Klein was startled. "He just finished eating. But I suggest you go to East Borough to have breakfast there. That way you can see a lot of things. I'll just need a cup of coffee when we're there." "No problem." Mike pointed outside. "The carriage I hired is waiting." Klein sized him up and said, "Sir, you'd better change into something a little worse, otherwise there will be lots of work for me." Mike looked down at his tweed coat and said with some realization, "This is too eye-catching." "It is in East Borough." Klein pointed into his place. "I have some specially prepared clothes. We are about the same size." Mike couldn't help but exclaim, "You really are a professional." "Professional criminal," Klein lampooned. After changing into ordinary workers' clothes, the two boarded the carriage and headed for the outskirts of East Borough. Achoo! Klein pulled out another piece of tissue paper, wiped his mouth and nose, and blew his nose. Since there was no trash can nearby, he folded the tissue paper properly and stuffed it back into his pocket. "The food in this coffee shop is okay. Of course, this is relative to the residents of East Borough." Klein pointed to the slightly greasy coffee shop at the corner of the street. He occasionally came here for breakfast, whenever he spent the night at his one-bedroom apartment that was nearby. "Looks like it's a pretty good restaurant." Mike didn't think it was a coffee shop. It was already past 9 o'clock, and there were very few customers in the coffee shop. East Borough residents typically finished their breakfast at around 7 and began to work or to look for work. After accompanying Mike as he ordered stewed beef with potatoes, bread, and coffee, Klein looked around for a window seat. At that moment, he saw an acquaintance, the elderly man he had helped while pretending to be a journalist. He was the one who brought me here in the first place. Why is he only having breakfast now? As Klein thought, he turned to Mike and said, "You have an interviewee." As he spoke, he carried his coffee cup to the tramp. The man was wearing the same thick jacket as before. His grizzled hair was oily, and his beard was obvious. However, he no longer looked tired, and his face was no longer as appallingly pale as before. "Good morning, we meet again." Klein sat down across him and greeted him, noticing that his breakfast was black bread with a large cup of cheap tea that was worth a penny. The elderly man raised his head, took a close look, and said in pleasant surprise, "Mr. Reporter, it's you." Klein laughed dryly, pointed at Mike and said, "This is my colleague. He wants to do a deeper investigation on my previous interview." Being an experienced and knowledgeable reporter, Mike didn't say anything further when he heard that. All he did was nod with a smile and greeted the elderly man. As for the matter of Detective Moriarty pretending to be a reporter, it wasn't like he had only found out about it today. He was the one who had lent him his fake reporter's identification. "So you really are a reporter?" The elderly man blurted out in astonishment. "But that doesn't stop you from being a kind-hearted person." Klein smiled and asked, "How have you been recently?" The elderly man drank a mouthful of tea and said, "Thanks to your help, I finally had a good night's sleep and ate my fill, so I wasn't that weak. My original plan was to go back to my original job, making shoes, but they didn't want me. They said." My hands shook. He lowered his head and chuckled, skipping that episode. "Later, I went down to the docks and found some work. It was tiring, but at least I made money. I've already rented a spot in someone's house for only 6.5 pence a week. Of course, I can only sleep there at night. Well, that's how working at the dock is like. I went early today and ate nothing. I raised my hand and shouted my name and the supervisor's name, but I wasn't chosen, so I had to come back here. Fortunately, there's still a chance in the afternoon. Those people in the morning might be busy till late and won't be fighting against us for those jobs." Klein listened quietly, occasionally taking a sip of the bad coffee. As for Mike, he took out a pen and paper and quickly made notes. Different from yesterday, finally, the elderly man with gray hair by his temples took a sip of tea and sighed with a smile. "In truth, this is already much better than my previous situation, and it's much better than many of the people here. For instance," he pointed out the window to the tramps huddled in a corner. Klein and Mike looked over and saw a group of cowering tramps lying on the ground, in a filthy place that provided shelter from the wind. They were of all sexes and ages. It was possible for them to never wake up again in the coldness of late autumn. It was then that Klein noticed an old woman in her 60s standing by the street. Her dress was old and worn, but she was relatively neat, and her hair was neatly trimmed. The white-haired old lady had the usual tired look of a tramp, but she still persisted in not squeezing together with the group. Instead, she slowly walked by the roadside, occasionally gazing into the coffee shop number. "She's also a pitiful person." The former tramp who had eaten the leftover black bread also noticed the old lady inside. She was said to have led quite a good life in the past. Her husband was a grain merchant and had a very spirited child, but unfortunately, he went bankrupt and her husband and child died not long after. "She's different from us, really, and you can tell at a glance, she won't be able to hold on much longer, unless she's lucky to be admitted into the workhouse every time." As he listened, Mike's expression changed from quiet to somber. He slowly let out a sigh and said, "I want to interview her. Can you invite her for me? She can eat and drink whatever she wants here." The man wasn't surprised by this request. He merely looked at Klein and Mike separately, as if to say, "The both of you are indeed colleagues." "Yes, I'm sure she would like that." He drank his tea, got up, and walked out of the greasy coffee shop. Not long after, the elderly woman in her old but tidy dress followed him in. Her pale face slightly lightened, thanks to the warmth of the coffee shop. She continued to tremble, as if she wanted to release the coldness in her body, bit by bit, and absorb the relatively high temperature within the coffee shop. Even after she sat down on the chair, it still took her a full minute before she could truly warm up. You can order whatever you want. This is the reward for accepting this interview, Klein spoke on Mike's behalf. After Mike nodded, the old lady modestly ordered toast, low-quality cream, and coffee. Then she smiled and said, I heard that one cannot eat greasy food after not having eaten in a while. Very polite, very self-restrained, not like a tramp at all, Klein sighed silently. Before the food arrived, Mike asked casually, Can you talk about how you became a tramp? The old lady revealed a look of reminiscence and said with a bitter smile, My husband was a grain merchant who mainly bought all kinds of grain from domestic farmers, but we rapidly went bankrupt ever since the Grain Act was repealed. He wasn't very young to begin with. After suffering that setback, his body quickly collapsed. Not long after, he passed away. My child, a brilliant young man, had been learning the ropes of doing business from his father. He couldn't suffer the blow, and he ended up jumping into the Tussock River on a moonless night. His first suicide didn't work. He was sent to the magistrate's court, and the police and judges were very impatient, feeling that he was wasting their time. If you want to commit suicide, please do so quietly and successfully. Don't trouble us, yes, that was probably what they wanted to say, but they found it too direct. My child was put in prison. Not long after, he committed suicide for the second time and succeeded. The old lady spoke very calmly, as though it wasn't something that had happened to her. But for some reason, Klein felt a deep sense of sorrow. Nothing is more lamentable than a dead heart. He suddenly recalled the saying he had heard in his previous life. In this world, suicide was not only prohibited by the churches, but it was a punishable crime. As for the reason, Klein knew very well why. First of all, many suicides were committed by jumping into a river, and without being discovered in time, there was a certain probability of them turning into a water ghost. Second, the suicider often had very abnormal emotion. Thus, under such states, ending their lives was equivalent to a sacrificial offering which could resonate with particular strange and terrifying existences. Thus, their corpses and certain objects that were around after them, after their deaths, would carry strange curses that harmed others. This was probably where the misfortune cloth puppet behind Tinjin City's Channy's gate came from. Therefore, the 7 Orthodox churches forbade their believers from committing suicide through their own doctrine, and the royal family also promoted the corresponding legislation. Of course, this seemed ridiculous to Klein. How could a suicider be afraid of punishment by the law? While Mike was taking notes, he was about to say something when the owner of the coffee shop brought the food over. Fill your stomach first, we'll talk later. Mike pointed to the toast. All right. The old lady ate the food in small bites, appearing very cultured. Having not ordered much, she quickly finished her meal. After reluctantly drinking the last mouthful of coffee, she rubbed her temples and pleaded, Can I get some sleep first? It's too cold outside. No problem, Mike answered without hesitation. The old lady thanked him gratefully a few times before she sat down on the chair and curled up into a ball as she fell asleep. Mike looked at the man beside him and said, You seem to be very familiar with this place. I wish to hire you as our guide. How's 3 solely for the day? I'm sorry, I forgot to ask for your name. The man quickly shook his head and said, No, that is too much. I only earn 1 solely a day, most of the time at the dock. Just call me Old Kohler. Then 2 solely a day. You deserve it, Mike decided firmly. After witnessing this strange bargaining, Klein blew into a piece of tissue and was about to drink another cup of coffee when he suddenly sensed that something was wrong. He turned to look at the old lady who was curled up, asleep on the chair. Her face, which had turned ruddy due to the coffee, was pale again. The colors of her aura and moods had vanished. See, Klein stood up and subconsciously extended his hand to check the old lady's breathing. As Mike and Kohler looked at him in surprise, he said heavily, She's dead. Mike opened his mouth, but no words came out. Kohler tapped his chest thrice and said with a bitter smile, I knew she wouldn't be able to hold on for long. Such things happen every day in Eastborough. At least she filled her stomach and died in a warm place. I hope it will be the same for me in the future. Klein was silent for a moment before he said, Kohler, go and get the police. All right. Kohler tapped his chest thrice once more and ran out of the coffee shop. The boss glanced over but didn't come over. It was as though it wasn't something he needed to concern himself. After a while, a policeman in a black and white checkered uniform, carrying a baton and revolver, entered the coffee shop. He looked at the dead old lady, asked Mike and Klein a few questions, then he waved his hand and said, That's all there is to this. The three of you can leave after I get someone to collect the corpse. That's it, Mike blurted out in surprise. He was obviously not very familiar with Eastborough. The policeman sneered. Such incidents happen in large numbers every day in Eastborough. He rolled his eyes and looked at Klein and Mike. You don't look like people from around here. Who are you? What's your identity? Mike produced his press identification, and Klein said that he was a private detective responsible for protecting him. The policeman's face turned serious as he looked at Klein and said, I suspect that you're carrying a gun illegally. Want to search your belongings. Please cooperate with me, otherwise it will be considered a case of resisting arrest. Mike was suddenly worried, because he knew that private detectives were usually unlawfully possessing firearms. Klein expressionlessly spread out his hands. All right. He let the policeman search him, but nothing was found on him. After the old lady's corpse was taken away, the disappointed policeman left. Mike clenched his fist and pounded on the table. A living person just died here, yet all he cares about is investigating the unlawful possession of firearms. Upon saying this, Mike looked at Klein and asked, puzzled, You didn't bring a gun? Klein shook his head, pulled out his holster and revolver from under the table, and said calmly, As a detective, I have a lot of experience in this area. As a magician, he could place the revolver right in front of someone and make it impossible for the person to notice it. Moreover, since he didn't buy any ordinary bullets, the Beyonder bullets were temporarily left above the gray fog. His revolver was currently empty, but this didn't stop him from shooting with his revolver. All he needed to do was to use his mouth to emulate a bang when he pulled the trigger. Upon seeing this, old Kohler whispered from the side, So you're a detective? Klein pointed at Mike and casually explained, I was also entrusted with a mission by this gentleman the last time as well. Mike sat there without refuting. After a moment of silence, he said, Although I've investigated the gangs and witnessed the miserable life of some prostitutes, am not familiar with the situation in Eastborough. Please help me open my eyes to this place, allowing me to see if there are any problems with this investigation plan. As he spoke, he took a few sheets of paper from the inside pocket of his clothes and spread them out on the coffee shop table. Klein glanced at him. Interviews with Eastborough residents of different ages. That's too troublesome. I think we can divide it according to location. In better apartments, 5 or 6 people squeeze into a one-room apartment. Others stay in the corner of a street that's sheltered from the wind, park benches, bars, and workhouses. In addition, they can be segregated by what time they begin work and when their rest times are. Mike listened carefully and nodded. Not a bad idea. What do you think, Kohler? Old Kohler pinched his nose and said, I can't read, but I think whatever Mr. Detective said seems all right. Mike thought about it, changed his plan, and said, Then let's go tow a nearby apartment and make a random selection. Adventure in Eastborough. Backlands Eastborough, at an intersection. Mike Joseph saw a number of pitiful-looking children in rags along the street. He wiped his mouth with a handkerchief and planned to head over to give them some pennies. However, his action was stopped by the former tramp, Old Kohler. They're thieves. Thieves? What about their parents? Or are they controlled by the gangs? As a senior journalist, Mike had never been to the East Borough, but he had heard of instances of a few gangs controlling street children to steal and beg. Parents? They either don't have parents, or their parents were once thieves or might still be thieves. Of course, Mr. Reporter, you're right. Many of them are under the control of gangs, and it's said that the gangs will teach them how to steal. For example, they will hang a gentleman's coat on a wall, put a handkerchief in the pocket, and hang a pocket watch on the outside, and through repeated practice, the children will attempt to steal the handkerchief without shaking the pocket watch. This is what I heard from others while at the workhouse when I was homeless. Old Kohler babbled on. I remember the youngest thief ever caught on this street was only 6 years old. 6 years old. He seemed to recall his child who was lost to a disease and couldn't help but take out a cigarette from his pocket. He couldn't bring himself to smoke it, so all he did was take a sniff. 6 years old. Mike was stunned by this number. Klein quietly listened inside. This is Eastborough. He looked around, composed himself, and said, This place is closer to the jungle than to human society. Our interview has to be treated as an adventure. You have to learn how to avoid the territory of dangerous creatures, but you must also avoid those little things that don't seem to be too harmful to you. Well, I'm talking about mosquitoes in the jungle. Mike, if you expose the thickness of your wallet to those kids, then even if you protect it well and don't let them steal it, robbery is a destined outcome during the rest of the adventure. If you dare to resist, then perhaps there will be one more body floating in the Tussock River tomorrow morning. Mr. Detective, you're absolutely right. There are so many people in Eastborough. No one pays notice to the few missing people every day, old Kohler agreed. Mike listened intently for a few seconds, and after a few seconds of silence, he suddenly said, 1.35 million. Huh? Because of his cold, Klein's throat was obviously a little hoarse. Mike stepped forward and said, this is a preliminary estimate of the population count of Eastborough. But I know that there's definitely more than that. That many? Old Kohler was startled. Although he had experienced the days and nights in Eastborough and knew that there were a lot of residents here, he didn't expect there to be this many. This is several times the population of Tingen City. Klein subconsciously compared it with the place that was most familiar to him. He looked at the intersection a few steps away and asked, which way should we go next? Old Kohler looked up and said, definitely not straight. That area is under the control of the Z-Manger gang. They're very vicious and completely unreasonable. If they discover any reporters doing interviews, then they'll definitely beat us up. The Z-Manger gang. Isn't that the brainless gang that caused me to lose 10,000 pounds? He was some kind of executioner. I don't even remember his name. Fortunately, the 10,000 pounds was eventually exchanged for the Sears corresponding sequence 7, 6, and 5 potion formulas, and the all-black eye, as well as the Inti's ambassador's life. I wonder who ended up obtaining the manuscript of the third-generation difference engine. Klein instantly recalled what had happened early last month. Z-Manger gang. The gang that is mainly composed of Highlanders. Mike asked thoughtfully, Mr. Reporter, have you heard of them? Old Kohler asked in surprise. Mike sneered. They're involved in a lot of cases, and they have some reputation outside Eastborough as well. It's said that one of the members was involved in a case of Inti's espionage. The person next to you was the person in question, the person who made the report, and also the victim, Klein silently added. If you gentlemen know about the Z-Manger gang, then why doesn't the police arrest them? Old Kohler asked from his viewpoint, of someone at the bottom of society. Mike's expression suddenly turned a little awkward, and he coughed twice. We can only capture those who have committed crimes. There is no evidence for the rest, so we can't arrest them. Moreover, Eastborough is so broad, and there are so many people. It would be hard to find anyone who is bent on hiding. As he spoke, he sighed. TT's easy to destroy one Z-Manger gang, but as long as a Highlander comes to Backland, and if they keep up their strong tradition of being combative while failing to find any other means of earning a living, it's only a matter of time before a new Z-Manger gang appears. This is a complex social issue. Klein pointed to the left and right. Pick one. Old Kohler looked at the right side of the street. That's where the Proscrito gang is active. As long as we don't provoke the girls who do business on the streets or in the bars, they won't notice us. It's still morning, so there shouldn't be any problems. They're still sleeping. The word Proscrito meant outlaw in the Lone language, so it could be said that the gang who gave itself such a name was pretty self-aware. Klein and Mike had no objection to this, and with the guide leading the way, they entered the district. The buildings here were relatively better. The streets were less squalid, and the air was filled with the smells of oyster soup, fried fish, ginger beer, and the smell of various food and beverages left behind by street vendors, as well as the fishy smell of fish-related products. While walking here, Klein felt an inexplicable sense of familiarity. It was as if he had returned to Tingen City, to Iron Cross Street, and to the street outside the apartment where he had originally lived in. The only difference was that Backland was closer to the sea and had more traffic. There was a lot more fish. This is a relatively good apartment in this area. Back when I loitered around here, I discovered that the gentlemen and ladies inside are all, quite clean. Old Kohler pointed to pale, yellow 3-story building. As they got closer, they noticed a sign hanging in front of the apartment. It had a picture of a pocket watch, a clock, and a screwdriver with the words watch repair. A watch craftsman lives here. Klein dug up a similar scene from the memory fragments of the original Klein. Back then, Benson, Melissa, and himself had gone to somewhere similar to repair the silver pocket watch which his father had left behind, but despite repairing it several times, it would quickly break. This continued until Melissa fiddled with it and ultimately fully repaired it. It became the most decent thing on Klein's person during that period of time. After Klein's death, the pocket watch, which had both monetary and sentimental value, was not buried with him. It should now belong to Benson, right? I wonder if he will think of me every time he takes out that pocket watch. Klein suddenly blinked and curled the corner of his lips. Probably. Mike wasn't sure. If anything went wrong with his pocket watch, it was usually sent to the original watch store he bought it from. The store would then send it to a repairman or to craftsmen who had partnered with them. As soon as they entered the apartment, they saw a middle-aged man with a messy beard. The gentleman had just come out of the bathroom and was about to return to his room. When he saw the three strangers come in, he hurriedly asked, "Do you want to repair something?" What a coincidence, we actually met the craftsman immediately. Klein was slightly puzzled. Mike took out his pocket watch, smiled, and said, "Yes, my pocket watch has recently not been keeping time well. Can you help me take a look?" He didn't reveal his identity and planned to interview him over some casual chit-chat. The middle-aged man immediately revealed a smile and led them into a two-bedroom apartment which had its door half concealed. He pointed at a chair beside the table and said, "Please wait a moment. I'll go get my tools." "Your tools are not at home?" Mike asked in surprise. The watch craftsman shook his head and laughed. "How is that possible? A set of tools is very expensive. There's no way I can buy them on my own. The only way is to pool everyone's money together to buy 3 or 4 sets, and whoever has business will use them. So we moved in together. Heh, it's more convenient this way. If we live too far away, we will have to spend extra time and pay for the public carriage to borrow the tool." As he spoke, he left the room and walked to the side. It isn't a coincidence that we met a watch craftsman. Many of the residents here are of this profession. Klein was suddenly enlightened. Old Kohler looked around the room and enviously said, "Before I fell ill, I lived in such a place as well. My wife would help others sew clothes at home. And my two children. Mike sighed and lowered his voice. He thought watch craftsmen were rich. Me too, Klein covered his mouth. After a cordial exchange with several of the apartment's residents, Klein and the others once again embarked on their adventure. They had walked about 100 meters when they heard people quarreling along the street. The two women were using all sorts of obscenities against each other, allowing Klein to learn many words he had never heard before. The reason for their argument was that the one on the left accused the woman on the right for making the apartment they lived in dirty and noisy. The woman on the right was scolding the woman on the left, thinking that it had nothing to do with her. After all, no one asked her to recruit guests at night and sleep during the day. "T.S. that a laundry maid?" Mike asked, frowning slightly. "Yes, I know her. She's a widow, helping people wash their clothes with her 2 daughters, Old Kohler answered certainly. Mike thought for a few seconds and said, "Take me to their place." Old Kohler nodded and led the two of them around the argument before they entered the dilapidated apartment building that was obviously inferior to the one they had just seen. As soon as he arrived outside the laundry maid's room, Klein immediately felt the dampness. In the room hung dresses that were not dried yet. A 17 or 18-year-old girl was squatting in front of a large basin, scrubbing clothes that were covered in bubble. A girl that was younger than her was holding a hot iron wrapped in wet linen cloth. She was carefully ironing the clothes that were done washing and drying. Her careful actions implied that she had been scalded by the steam several times. This was both their workplace and the place where they slept at night. Wet moisture permeated the room and seeped into their body. In addition, the stench of all kinds of smells was very distinct. "Doesn't it feel terrible?" Mike pinched his nose. Klein replied in a muffled voice, "I've got a cold." There was no humor in his words. Mike released his fingers, walked into the room and said to the two surprised girls, "I'm a reporter. I would like to interview a laundry maid." The girl who was scrubbing the clothes shook her head numbly and said, "We have a lot of things to do and cannot afford to waste time." Mike's request for an interview was rejected. He came out with a heavy expression and silently walked back across the street. After taking a look, he pursed his lips and said, "Let's continue." City of Silver. After a thorough examination of Derek Berg, who had experienced hallucinations both visually and auditory, he was brought to the bottom of the spiral. This place took in residents who showed signs of losing control, and various methods were used to save them. Walking in the gloomy and creepy corridor, he suddenly felt a strange chill. "Help!" A sharp, shrill voice suddenly sounded from a sealed room. "Help!" The voice came to a sudden halt, and then there was silence. This, in the eerie silence, the first thought Derek Berg had when he came back to his senses was to rescue that person. However, the two guards that held him in the middle didn't show any reaction to it, as if everything that had just happened was just his imagination. "Someone is calling out for help," the young Derek informed the two Dawn Paladins. On his left, a tall knight clad in silver armor calmly replied, "Don't be fooled. That's just the normal behavior of those Beyonders, who are on the verge of losing control." "Is that so?" Maybe he cried out for help because he just isn't willing to give up and lose control and become a monster, Derek thought sorrowfully. Following the change in his mood, the illusory, buzzing sound in his ears became more distinct. After silently taking a few steps forward, the Dawn Paladin from before pointed to a door on the left and said, "You will be staying here for the time being. It will bring you your food and medicine on time." As he spoke, he took out an iron-black bottle. This bottle was constructed from the remnants of the straw-like object left over from the City of Silver's staple food, black-faced grass. Upon encountering a liquid, it would produce a thin film, thereby achieving a waterproof and sealing effect. Derek took the bottle and gulped it down, feeling a cool sensation slide down his esophagus and into his stomach. His entire being rapidly became quiet. The swaying scenes before his eyes stabilized, and the auditory hallucinations in his ears gradually weakened. Creak. At the sound of the iron door closing and locking, Derek entered his own room. The first thing he saw was a candle flickering with a faint yellow light, and then he made out a low bed, a chair, and a square table. Other than that, there was nothing else. However, the walls, including the door, were all engraved with complicated and mysterious symbols and labels. They seemed to form a complete seal. Derek's emotions were also suppressed by the medicine. He sat down on the bed, without the slightest hint of curiosity before lying down. After an unknown period of time, he suddenly heard the sound of someone banging on his door. However, this didn't come from outside his room, but from his neighboring cell. Derek sat up and listened. He heard a sharp, high-pitched wail from the knocking. His hair stood on end as he abruptly stood up, taking an extremely defensive stance. At this moment, thumping sounds spread to the metal walls that were separated by two rooms, slowly smashing a protrusion. Derek was about to pray for holy light when the scene before his eyes suddenly lit up. It seemed as if the entire space around him had been moved to the outside world, just in time for the lightning to streak past. The sound of the wall being smashed beside him had vanished, and the bottom of the spire regained its silence. It wasn't an absolute silence. Rather, the sound of light footsteps echoed for a long distance. It only turned silent after the echoes continued on for a long time. Derek was wondering what had happened to the Beyonder in the neighboring cell when someone knocked on the metal wall on the other side. Taku, taku, taku. It was as if someone had bent their finger and was tapping lightly. "Who is it?" Derek asked, raising his voice in slight alarm. The knocking immediately stopped, and after a few seconds, a deep yet rather old voice was faintly transmitted. "So it turns out to be a young fellow. You are..." Seeing that the other person could communicate rationally, Derek leaned against the wall and pressed his ear against the cold metal. The elderly voice chuckled and said, "The person next to you almost lost control several times. He ultimately couldn't be saved today." "He completely lost control?" Derek asked through the metal wall, "So he's become a monster now?" "No, not a monster, but a corpse. He was finished off by the item sealed in here." The elderly voice sighed. "I've been here for 42 years. Yes, those guards told me that they've seen too many similar incidents." Derek was surprised and returned with a question. "You've been here for 42 years. Normally speaking, losing control could be divided into 3 stages. The first stage was warning signs, such as auditory and visual hallucination. In the second stage, the person's body and mind were already out of control, and from time to time, they would display either terrifying or strange states. As for the third stage, it was a complete breakdown, transforming the rampager into a terrifying monster. The time it took from the second stage to the third stage was rather quick. Perhaps just after discovering the symptoms, one would witness a seemingly ordinary Beyonder turn into a monster which could be found deep in the darkness. In other words, after a second stage Beyonder was sent to the bottom of the spire, They would either be treated with medicine, rituals, and other methods, slowly stabilizing themselves and allowing them to leave within 18 months. Otherwise, they would quickly lose control and be purged. It was impossible for anyone to be locked up for 42 years. As a first-stage beyonder, they would only take between a few days to less than 20 days to eliminate all the symptoms and leave, fully treated. The elderly voice immediately chuckled and said, "That's right, I also didn't expect that I would stay here for 42 years. He don't have any signs of losing control, but they believe I'm rather dangerous and can turn into a monster at any time." Derek frowned slightly and asked curiously, what happened 42 years ago? At that time, neither of his parents had been born yet. The elderly voice was silent for a moment before saying, "I was once the captain of an exploration team. We found a destroyed city about half a month away from the city of Silver. This was calculated based on our speed. That city was similar to our city of Silver. It clearly has traces of it being ruled by giants, and it also believed in the Lord that created everything, the omnipotent and omniscient God. Unfortunately, they were destroyed countless years ago." Derek wasn't a stranger to such matters. He immediately guessed, because you encountered some strange incidents there, you were determined to be at risk of losing control. More or less. The elderly voice chuckled. After we explored the core area, we discovered that the city was attempting to change faiths. They created deities that they imagined would save them. However, it was useless. Even the statues of those deities were destroyed and spilled all across the land. At this point, his tone suddenly became heavy. "However, we met a person there. This is the first time in the past 2,000 years that our city of Silver had met someone who didn't belong to our city. Outside City of Silver, in the depths of the endless darkness, there really was someone still alive." Derek subconsciously asked, "You brought him back to the City of Silver?" The elderly voice said after 2 seconds, "Don't you feel shocked? The reason why our City of Silver works so hard to explore the surrounding is to find humans like us. We finally found them 42 years ago. This is indeed rather shocking news, but I often see Miss Justice, Mr. Hanged Man and the others. I often hear of the Lone Kingdom and the 7 Orthodox gods. Isn't it very obvious that there are people outside the City of Silver, with cities and country?" Derek scratched his head, and without much experience, he pretended to be shocked. "I didn't notice this point. This is truly unbelievable. Other than the residents of the City of Silver, there are actually other people." 74. The elderly voice remained silent for a while before saying, "Has the City of Silver's education become so terrible?" Without waiting for Derek to speak, he sighed and said to himself, "We very warily invited that person to the City of Silver as a guest." After some consideration, he agreed. We monitored and escorted him along the way back, but when we had almost arrived at the City of Silver, he suddenly disappeared. We searched everywhere, but we couldn't find him. After we returned to the City of Silver, my team members went crazy, one by one. They lost control. All of them. Not a single one was spared. The 6-member council suspected that we were contaminated by something, and that the person was not a human at all, but an evil spirit, a monster. So they locked me up here, and every so often they would come over to confirm my condition, but they would never tell me what the problem is, nor would they let me out." Derek exhaled heavily and asked, "Do you remember what that man looked like?" "He looked very ordinary, and nothing about him stood out. He was dressed just like us, and except for me remembering that he was a man, I can't remember what he looked like. However, the elders should be able to use beyonder means to directly see him from my vague, forgotten memories." The elderly voice recalled for nearly a minute and said with a bit of pain. Derek pressed him casually, "Did he say what his name was? Did he tell you about his origins?" The elderly voice acknowledged tersely. "He told us that his name was—" He paused for a moment before saying, "Ammon. Sunday morning, in the factory district." In the past 2 days, Klein and Mike visited many places in East Borough under Old Kohler's guidance. As a result, Mike witnessed 5 or 6 people huddled together in a single room, and that wasn't the worst case he saw. In the poorest areas of East Borough, an ordinary bedroom could accommodate 10 people. The precise division of the right to use the floor and the time of use, day or night, shocked the reporter. Moreover, poverty didn't discriminate between men and women. In those places, people of different genders squeezed in tight spaces without being able to abide by societal norms. Certain incidents which deserved time in court happened all the time. Whether it was men or women, all of them were always facing the threat of violence. Squalid, crowded, smelly, that's the most objective impression. I suspect that every one of them has a serious problem of having parasites, because the houses were built a long time ago in the most rundown districts. They aren't connected to the sewer. Feces, urine, vomit, and other things can be found everywhere. Every house here only has one public bathroom, or worse, every street only has one public toilet. They're extremely busy every day, but they can only barely fill their stomachs without any saving. As long as they're unemployed for a few days, they'll fall into an irredeemable abyss. I don't think they would even be afraid of death if they were given even a little hope, Mike wrote in his investigation manuscript. In addition, the reporter was impressed by the tramps who wandered the streets in the middle of the night, the girls who stood numbly by the street or in the bars, as well as the drinkers who completely let loose with their drinking. They didn't hold back on using violence and didn't consider the future. All of this left a deep impression on this reporter. He grew more and more silent,